Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Catherine. I would also like to thank the Decorative Arts Trust for inviting me, the other speakers for sharing their fantastic research this morning, and for all of you who are joining us this morning on this cold January day. So, this talk will examine how ideas about handwork, progressive era reform, and regionalism were utilized at Berea College from the 1890s through 1936 to improve the lives of white Appalachians, connect them to modern industrializing American economy, and simultaneously help develop ideas of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nationalism through the production, sale, and promotion of the Appalachian craftwork. As we will see, craft goods made by white Appalachians and even Appalachian Americans themselves were marketed and sold to consumers as authentically American by virtue of their makers' geographic and cultural isolation and perceived racial purity. Although the focus of my research and this talk are centered predominantly in the Progressive era, it's worth taking a few moments to talk about Berea, Kentucky as a community and a learning institution. If you're not familiar with Berea College, it's a very special place, both in terms of its history and the work it's done and continues to do for students from disadvantaged backgrounds and marginalized communities. John G. Fee, or Father Fee, as he's referred to in Berea histories, was a minister from Kentucky who, although descended from abolitionist Quakers, grew up with and later inherited 12 enslaved people from his father. Fee manumitted those people that his family had enslaved and took up the abolitionist banner with a passion. When attending an abolitionist rally in Ohio in mid-1850s, Fee was struck by the fact that the white abolitionists present would not even eat with or sit with the very people they sought to free. Incensed and inspired, Fee returned to Kentucky where he met and befriended another wealthy Kentucky politician and enslaver turned abolitionist, Cassius Clay. Clay secured land in Jackson County, Kentucky, and donated it to Fee for the creation of an intentional community that he would call Berea. The location was important as it was close enough to the bluegrass region of the state to be useful and accessible to the Black communities seeking an education, and close enough to the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky so as not to attract the ire of the local planter class who might have had issues with the education of Black people. Berea started as an intentional community based on the principles of non-sectarian Protestant Christianity and the idea of interspersion, which is Fee's idea for the forced integration of all races. And the core tenet, which you can see on the medallion before you, which is still Berea's motto, God hath made of one blood all nations. Soon, Fee attracted the attention not only of supporters, but of Kentuckians who saw Fee's work for social equality and racial harmony to be a threat to Kentucky's agricultural livelihood. And so an armed mob of white Kentuckians drove the Bereans from their home in 1859. Fee and the other Bereans fled across the Ohio River, and almost as soon as they arrived, the Civil War broke out. Fee began working at Camp Nelson, just outside of Cincinnati, and would continue to work there until the war's end. Camp Nelson was a refugee camp primarily for Black Americans, formerly enslaved, who had been displaced by the war or sought their freedom on the other side of the Ohio River. Conditions were deplorable, and outbreaks of disease and food and fuel shortages were common. Here you can see an image of a row of the camp. Cramped conditions and a lack of modern sanitation engineering made places like Camp Nelson breeding grounds for disease. And in fact, in 1864, they had a terrible epidemic of cholera and diphtheria that killed hundreds of people. Berea College often refers to this period as the Berea Exile or the Berea Exodus. And I think that moniker is fitting because it was at Camp Nelson that Fee, his wife, and his colleagues really began the educational work that would become Berea College. The image here shows a group of about 50 young Black women being taught by a white female teacher. There's a white bearded man seated in the chair that you can just kind of make out in the photo, and I do think that this very well could be Fee. It's hard to distinguish. They all had the same kind of beard. All of the founding fathers of Berea all had the same facial hair profile, so it's hard to be certain. Fee and his colleagues returned to Berea after the war in 1866. Berea College officially opened in 1869 with a class of 70 students, 50 of them Black, 20 white, male and female both. Berea has the distinction of being the oldest coeducational and racially integrated college in the South. The ratio of Black and white students remained close to 50-50 throughout the college's early years, but as Reconstruction ended and the abolitionist and Civil War generation began to pass away and Jim Crow sentiment began to rear its ugly head in the South, sentiment started to catalyze and the college found itself with an admissions and funding dilemma. The college's solution was a new Oberlin-educated classics professor, Dr. William Goodell Frost, who would become Berea College's third president. Frost was a Wisconsin-born, Oberlin-educated classicist and Congregationalist minister. Frost's family were prominent abolitionists who moved from Massachusetts to the Finger Lakes region of New York, eventually settling in Wisconsin. His father was among the founding members of the Republican Party at the cabin in Wisconsin. Most importantly for Berea, he was a man of many ideas and willing to apply modern progressive era theories about education, not just toward saving a struggling Berea college, but toward uplifting the local populations, both black and white. Frost's plan for Berea was multi-pronged, but centered around making Berea a place that was useful to the people closest to it. He asked and attempted to solve many important questions. Why have just a four-year liberal arts college in rural eastern Kentucky when there's almost no jobs for graduates there? How could Berea College meet the needs of the local populations where they were, both socially and economically? How can you sustain a college if your students don't have regular access to cash economies or cash at all? Under Frost's administration, Berea College grew from an American Missionary Association-funded liberal arts college with a failing and fledgling normal school program into a progressive learning laboratory set in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky. The normal school was established in the 1870s by Frost's predecessor to train black teachers for the few privately funded schools for black children in the state. There was no public education instituted for black children in Kentucky until much later. Frost expanded that normal school and added additional academic divisions, eventually leading to the creation of what's called Berea College and Affiliated Schools, which was composed of the college, the normal school, the academy, which was the high school, the foundation school, which is an experiment in continuing education. It was for students that had not essentially received their elementary school education and came in over the age of 15. Also, a vocational school was added. It was in these lower schools that industrial and manual arts education were first introduced at Berea by Frost. There's an array of educational opportunities offered to students at Berea was part of Frost's idea about adaptive education, that is, providing educational opportunities for people where they are, both again socially and geographically and economically, rather than where the dominant culture felt they should be. Poor black and white communities in Kentucky did not always understand the value of advanced education, and there were even fewer jobs for these people where they lived that warranted a bachelor's degree. Kentuckians needed education at all levels. Frost took this a step further and developed his own self-funded extension services, sending teachers on mule and horseback throughout the counties of eastern Kentucky to educate communities in situ where they were and help instill in them an idea that there's a value to education outside of subsistence farming. In exchange for this, students were recruited to come to campus, and in lieu of paying tuition, they were offered an opportunity to work on campus, which became Berea's labor program. So in exchange for 10 hours of labor per week, students at Berea College go for free, and this continues to this very day. Early Berea pamphlets often called the college a self-help college, where students can earn to learn. As Frost worked to save the school and expand its programs, he began to notice more and more the people and culture of white Eastern Kentuckians and its similarities to rural American life in his grandparents' generation at the tail end of the federal period. It was this group Frost would utilize to promote and save Berea College from financial ruin. His own work with local white communities and the work of the early extension agents led Frost and his colleagues to believe, incorrectly, that these isolated pockets of white East Kentuckians and their neighbors in the Appalachian sections of the other southern states were a special kind of internal ethnic group. He called them Appalachian Americans. They would be identified not just by where they came from, but how they looked, sounded, the ways they lived, and most importantly for me, what they made. Frost is often credited with coining the term Appalachian Americans, and while there is some debate there, it's clear that he was the one that popularized and promoted the term's use through a barrage of speaking and fundraising campaigns designed to support Berea not just on the basis of social and economic uplift for all needy peoples, but specifically on the uplift and development of this newly discovered ultra-American group of white deserving poor. But who were these Appalachian Americans, and why were they so worthy of uplift? In articles and speeches titled Our Contemporary Ancestors and New England and Kentucky, Frost argued that Appalachian Americans were different than other poor white people in the southern states. They were of pioneer stock, most having fought in the American Revolution. The geography of Appalachia protected the purity of their cultural practices, including their songs, dances, dialects, and craftways. And Appalachians were the good kind of southern whites because they had supported the Union and abhorred slavery. Their isolation had never put them into competition with enslaved labor, so they weren't as racist either. Lastly, Frost argued that these people had stable nerves and strong constitutions, something lacking in a rapidly industrializing and immigrant-infiltrated Protestant-era America. Of course, none of this was particularly true, but the campaign worked. Frost raised millions of dollars, and Berea grew both in size, student number, and national reputation. Frost's definition also excluded non-white groups of Appalachian Americans and indigenous Appalachians from the conversation, helping to further support what becomes the monocultural myth of Appalachians as rural wasps and hillbillies, a legacy that continues to this day. Fireside industry, another Frost-coined term, was the material culture and retail arm of this campaign to fundraise for and promote the work of the college and its schools, and it was born out of these early trips into the hollers of East Kentucky. Frost and his extension agents encountered people who lived a primarily subsistence lifestyle and produced almost everything they needed themselves. They lived in cabins, had comparatively large families, and some of the oldest of them still spun and wove homespun, and most impressive to Frost were the overshot coverlets, which were often referred to by him and his contemporaries as homespun quilts, as you can see here, or kivers, which is an Appalachian Scottish made-up word, which is short for covers or coverlet. These coverlets were collected by agents and often bartered by students to cover school expenses outside of the covered tuition. These earliest coverlets were true heirlooms. They were antiques. They were not woven fresh. They were things that had come down in the families of the students generations before. Frost took bunches of these coverlets and yardage of homespun with him on his trips, so when he was giving these lectures, he was selling things too. He used these as evidence of Appalachian material culture akin to that found in early America, but also he sold them. The first fireside industry sales happened at Frost Lectures and the homespun fairs held at Berea during commencement week. It was at one of these fairs in 1902 when arts and crafts design royalty, Candace Wheeler, came to Berea. She met with Frost and his wife and really helped to organize the manufacturing and retail operation of what would become known as Fireside Industries. In reality, isolated as it was, most of Appalachia was actually connected to the modern American economy in various ways, particularly through extractive industries like logging and mining. And people often bought rather than made their goods, particularly textiles, as soon as they were able to. It's hard work, and it takes a long time. Demand increased and soon orders began pouring in for lengths of homespun linen, woolens, and the famous combination of fibers called linsey-woolsey. And of course the blankets, counterpanes, and the overshot coverlets. You can see here an incredibly rare 1899 order and receipt for 2 blue and white coverlets from George S. Webster, who resided at 107 East 45th Street here in New York City. It was actually thanks to the grant provided very generously by the Decorative Arts Trust that I was able to find this order and the rest of the early documentation of Fireside Industries, which had been lost in the Berea College Special Archives and collections to a vertical file. The earliest records had been cut apart by later directors and stored in a vertical file, put in a folder, and then sort of forgotten about. So this collection of documents has become the core of my dissertation and a key to understanding the formation and development of that earliest period of Appalachian craft revival at Berea from the 1890s to the 1930s. Berea's fame was not only regional and national, but international. Berea displayed and won premiums for its hand weaving at 3 different World's Fairs, the 1893 Columbian Expo in Chicago, the 1900 Exposition Universelle Internationale in Paris, and the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Expo in St. Louis. They also displayed and were a major part of Kentucky's presence at the 1907 Jamestown Expo in Virginia, and later the 1933 Century of Progress Expo in Chicago and the 1939 World's Fair right here again in New York. With its reputation and backstory established and per Wheeler's advice, Fireside Industries truly organized in the first decade of the 20th century. There were no weaving instructors at Berea. Few mountain people actually remembered how to weave, but remembered their grandmothers doing it. And so mathematics professor Josephine Robinson and later home economics professor Jenny Lester Hill worked with local women in and around Berea to organize and operate a cottage industry where the school would purchase and provide materials and equipment to local women so that they might weave in their spare time, earn extra money, and improve their lives and the lives of their family through their craft work. The idea was that this kind of work did not disrupt the local culture and in fact fostered its renewal and retention in the face of industrialization. This cottage craft economy was seen by Frost and his supporters as a way to connect these Appalachian Americans to a modern consumer economy in a way that protected the perceived authenticity of an otherwise imagined culture. While the weaving might not have been done by Berea students, other industrial and manual arts training courses did blossom into crafts, marketing, and retail opportunities for the school. Sloyd training for young students, a brickworks, woodcraft, and broomcraft were all created in order to train male students in trade, provide them with work opportunities to offset personal and college expenses, and to provide the materials and furnishings the school needed. Female students could participate in sewing, dressmaking, and domestic science coursework, but the weaving was done by locals, not students. In 1904, the Kentucky legislature passed something called the Kentucky Day Law, which required the segregation of all schools in the state, with no plan in place to create a public segregated school system for Kentucky's black children. Berea complied immediately, but also fought back. Frost and Berea College fought this law at great expense, actually spending half of the endowment Frost worked to build to try to stop the process, and they lost at the Supreme Court appeal in 1907. Berea's solution was to use half of its endowment that Frost had worked for nearly 15 years to raise, to use that fund to found Lincoln Institute in 1911. South of Louisville in western Kentucky, Lincoln opened in 1911 and remained open until 1966. Like Berea, there were upper and lower schools and vocational and manual arts education. Unlike Berea, however, that training was solely designed to train laborers, not makers. There was no weaving, no celebration of cultural handwork. There was carpentry for young men and dressmaking for female students, and that is it. Unlike at Berea, Lincoln's industrial programs trained students to follow designs, not make them. Berea reintegrated in 1950 before Brown versus Board of Education when the Kentucky legislature rescinded the day law. In 1911, Berea and Fireside Industries welcomed its most famous director, Anna Ehrenberg. Ehrenberg was a weaver and a weaving instructor from Sweden, long famous for its own elite hand weaving revival that began in the 1870s. In 1911, she was recruited to Berea from New York City, where she taught at Pratt Institute and opened her own custom weaving firm. At Berea, Ehrenberg continued to develop the cottage industry while also building up the number of looms Berea owned and operated to over 25. She began teaching interested students and training local women. Ehrenberg also became the face of Fireside Industry. Her year was split between training and traveling. In the fall and winter, she would load up with goods and hit the Chautauqua circuits, ladies' clubs, and church bazaars of the East Coast and Midwest cities. In the spring and summer, she was in Berea managing, training, ordering, and organizing a thriving business. She was busy and in high demand, and this level of work, coupled with her somewhat blunt Northern European sensibilities, did not always earn her the love of the Berea community. She often pushed back against and set boundaries with college administrators, industrialist members of the Board of Trustees, and even potential customers who had expected Ehrenberg to carry herself as a demure Southern lady. She was not. William H. Danforth, founder of Ralston, Purina, and Berea College trustee, saw the success of Ehrenberg's work and thought he could improve on it by making it more efficient and industrial. Ehrenberg subtly and sometimes bluntly pushed back at every available opportunity, and in a letter from Danforth to another board member, he famously refers to her as a porcupine full of quills, which is the name of my Ehrenberg chapter. Love or hate her, there's no denying that Ehrenberg was a master of her craft and was great at promoting Berea's Fireside Industries. One of the earliest and most important contributions she made, not only to Berea College, but to the hand-weaving revival in in America, is the introduction and popularization of Scandinavian loom forms in Appalachia. Her Ehrenberg loom and the cheaper Berea loom became the loom of the hand-weaving revival in Appalachia. Frost and Ehrenberg made an agreement before she was hired that she would allow Berea woodcraft students to make and sell her loom designs. She asked for a $5 fee on top for every loom sold, but she waived that if the customer was a weaving center. She also neglected to patent her design on purpose and encouraged weaving centers to purchase one loom and then have their own students build the rest. Today, it's possible to find Ehrenberg looms in almost every single older Appalachian weaving center throughout the entire region. Many of Ehrenberg's students would also go on to work at and or found new centers and schools across the region, and she used her looms and her methods of dressing the loom. This early blueprint schematic is incredibly important because it was drawn and designed by a Cuban refugee from the American occupation of Cuba. His name is Carlos de los Santos. He did that when he was 14 years old in a drafting class at the academy and would go on to California to become a pretty successful and prominent architect. Ehrenberg was not just a designer, she was also a teacher and a businesswoman and also a collector of historic weaving drafts. She was also part of a much larger network of women that I'm working to sort of unravel and unpack as to sort of what their role was in sort of greater scheme of craft revival. Berea itself becomes a center of craft revival under her leadership. She's able to raise enough money by 1917 to build what she calls the Log Palace, but what Berea now refers to as the Log House Gift Shop. The first two floors were dedicated to teaching and retail. The top floor was her living space. Second floor of that space would later become the Wallace Nutting Museum, as we'll see. President Frost and Ehrenberg both worked themselves to physical exhaustion and ill health, but by the 1920s, their success attracted the attention of many wealthy and powerful industrialists and colonial revivalists like William Danforth and Wallace Nutting. After a series of strokes, Frost retired in 1920, and his successor, William J. Hutchinson, had different visions for Berea. Hutchins sought to focus on the liberal arts college, gradually abandoning support for the affiliated schools, and to centralize and streamline the disparate Berea industries, which on paper seemed to be disorganized, mismanaged, and unreliable earner with little to no consideration for how much the mere existence and promotion of that craft work had done to bring in donations. Wallace Nutting began sending furniture samples to the college in the 1920s, and in the 1940s, at his passing, he left in his will actually every one of the businesses except for the picture business and the entire Framingham factory and a majority of the collections of furniture to Berea. So Berea still owns the licensing rights to the Wallace Nutting name. And so for my conclusions, the success of Berea's student craft ultimately led to the market saturation and commercialization. 1930 saw the creation of the Southern Hunt and Craft Guild, which would take the lead from Berea in promoting Appalachian craftways. Mass tourism and infrastructure development opened Appalachia to outsiders and allowed Appalachians to look for opportunities outside the mountains for the first time. And honestly, the planning and foresight that Berea with Frost and Ehrenberg had, coupled with the very rapid industrialization and changes linked in Appalachia that were tied to World War I, the change in the Roaring '20s, and also the Great Depression, shifted the industry such that it couldn't really keep up with and support the earlier philanthropic goals that it went. So it does become purely commercial by the end. And with that, I would like to say thank you all so much. If you have any questions or anything, I'll be around.